Hey guys, how you doing? I wanted to go ahead and create a screencast to go over some of the core concepts that we've been going through with this new project, the drum machine project, where we're describing a single pad on a drum machine. And what we're doing is we're really kind of working out this idea of thinking about programming in this object-oriented way. So we're thinking about objects. And really, this important distinction between what a class is in our program and what an object is, right? You guys remember what that is? The class, think of it like a blueprint. The class is describing something that we would like to build. An object is something that we've already built using a class that's already there. So what we're doing in this example is we're defining our own class or blueprint, and we're also using blueprints that are already established, already developed in our system, and building the tools that are there already. And we're doing that through this project of synthesizing sound. So we're using some of the P5JS sound library objects in order to be able to create sound. So where we left off, we have this idea of a pad. Now we're drawing this idea of a pad based on what we know of a drum machine. So if we look at a drum machine again, we could see here that a drum machine consists of usually some type of grid of buttons. They could be a grid or they could be in a line like this, right? But I keep going back to this product here. So this has this kind of 4x4 grid. Each one of these is considered a pad. So right now, we're describing just one of these. And we're describing basically the properties of it and any functionality that it should have, right? So if we go back to our code, you can see here that we've defined a class. So we're defining a new blueprint. We're calling it pad. And then we have our first function, or what we call a method, which is a function inside of a class. And we're giving it 3 parameters. So we're basically giving it kind of 3 knobs, if you will, for future configuration for the builder. So whoever wants to build this, they can pass in an X and a Y and a frequency, and then we're going to go ahead and we're going to use that within the actual constructed object to be able to kind of set the features of how this particular pad should work. But it's important to note that what we're describing here using this class, we're describing any amount of pads, right? Because this is a blueprint. So we can build as many pads as we want. And really the goal of this assignment is going to be create multiple pads and put them in an array. So I want to kind of build you up to the point of being able to do that. So I won't spend too much time going into the kind of the 3 core objects that we've built here in order to synthesize sound, right? We learned in class this past week that we needed this oscillator, we needed an envelope, and we needed this amplitude object in order to actually create sound. And then we created this play method that allows us to use these built tools inside of this object, right? Inside of this object to be able to use these objects to actually play the sound. So where we left off was we have our setup function, and then inside of our setup function, we do our typical create canvas, and we created a black background. And here's where the magic happens. Here's where we actually start to use the blueprint that we've defined. So now we're thinking of this in terms of we're a builder. We're now building a pad. And we use this new keyword to build a pad. And then we pass in our configuration for that given pad. So we're saying that X should be 10, Y should be 10, and the frequency should be 225. And then once we've built that bad boy, we're going ahead and we're going to hit play. We're going to call the play method. That play method is going to just simply use any of the internal implementation details to actually play a sound. That's one of the beautiful parts about object-oriented programming, is that it's encapsulating and abstracting any details that are internal to that blueprint. As a user of a pad, we don't really have to care about what's inside the play method. Just like if we go down here and look at how we built the oscillator and the envelope and the analyzer, when we call these methods set ADSR, set range, we don't know the code that's inside of it. And quite honestly, from our perspective, we don't care right now. We just know that we need to call them to be able to use this tool, right? It's kind of like driving a car, right? When you hit a pedal on a car, it goes. When you turn the steering wheel, it turns. You don't need to know all the intimate details about how that mechanically works. It's been abstracted away into a very easy to use interface for you to go ahead and operate that car. That's one of the core principles about object-oriented programming. In fact, if you studied object-oriented programming kind of more formally, you'll learn that there are 4 pillars to object-oriented programming. I won't go into those right now, but I encourage you to maybe do a quick Google search to see what those 4 pillars are. So now we're left with this. So what we're expecting is that when we run this program, we should hear a sound. So let's run it. We don't hear a sound. Okay. So now if I go ahead and right click this, go to inspect, which is the normal thing that you want to do. You want to look at your console. You're going to see this error. The audio context was not allowed to start. This is where we left off in class. Basically, the problem here is that Google Chrome is trying to be courteous and saying, hey, the user has already interacted with the page and then you're trying to play a sound for them. I'm not sure the user wants to do that. So I'm going to block that sound and assume that you're trying to do something bad. So a way around that is we need to use an internal functionality of the browser to resume the audio context. Now, I'm not going to go into too much detail here, but basically, right before we hit this play, we need to add this line of code. So this line of code is get audio context, and it's a function which returns an object, which means we could go ahead and use the dot notation and then call resume. Now, what's going to happen here is, and you know what, hopefully my sound is set up here where you can hear this. If I refresh, you should, I actually have to save it. There you go. You should hear sound there. Boom, boom, boom. So if you're not hearing that sound, you can see that there's a little sound icon up here that is playing the sound. And if you do it yourself, you should actually hear that sound. So if you go ahead and hit refresh, you should hear it. Let me get out of this and go back into it. Oh, it stopped on me. Are we getting that error again? Let's see. We are. Okay, well we're gonna go ahead and move this out of this anyway. So the goal here is not to necessarily play the audio the second the setup function executes. We want to be able to play the audio or play a specific pad really when the user hits a key. So what key do you guys think we're going to use, or what function do you think we're going to use in order to do that? Let's go ahead and let's pull up our P5JS reference. And let's dip into this a little bit and let's scroll down. We have our rendering functions, our data. Let's events, right? We want to listen for events. We want to use that event system. So we have a bunch of mouse functions over here. So we can probably use mouse clicked, mouse released, mouse pressed. We could probably use any one of these for the mouse interaction, but that's not going to help us for the keyboard. We can probably use these bad boys, right? Key pressed or key released. So why don't we go ahead and look at key pressed. Now key pressed is going to allow us to call a function when a key is pressed. Now let's go ahead and try to implement this. Let's see what happens. So if we go here and right below the setup function, I'm going to say function key pressed. And instead of playing here, I'm going to go ahead and grab this and put this here. And now, is this going to work? Do I have access to this P variable inside of the key pressed function? This is kind of working out some knowledge a little earlier in the semester. Where do we define the P variable? inside of the setup function, right? So is it a local variable or is it a global variable? If it's local, it only has, you can only access that variable within the context of the function that it is defined in. If it's global, we can access it within any function in our code. So in this case, it's local because we defined it here, let p equals, right? So all we have to do here is make this global, and I'm going to take this up here and say let p. And we're not going to actually initialize it up here, but we're just going to go ahead and define it. So it's in a global scope. So now we have access to p everywhere. Now let's go ahead and refresh this. If we hit a key, we should get a sound. I have a feeling the browser is still blocking my audio here, but let's do this too. Let's prove that we're getting into this function by also doing a console log and saying key pressed. Now if we press a key, there we go, and we're getting a sound. Boom, 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 boom. And we're getting this on the console. We can almost make a little... I hope this is coming through the video. If it's not, as you play along, you'll get it on your end. But now we do have audio coming through. Awesome. So now the question here is, and this is where I'm gonna leave you guys off to try to figure this out yourself, is following some of the patterns that we did in our objects lessons, where we used this emitter array. And we then created new particles and we added them to the array. I want to do the same thing, but I want to do it with not a particle, but with a pad. So what I'd like you guys to do is define a new array. Let's call it, say, drum machine. Or we could call it soundboard maybe, because we called the file soundboard, right? Whatever you want to call it. And then we want to populate this list or this array with a bunch of pads. So think about how you would do that. So that's really the assignment for this week, is to populate the soundboard with, say, let's do 8 pads. Okay, so we're going to populate the soundboard with 8 pads. So this will contain 8 pads once we populate. Okay, and now the big hint here is that we want to populate this with 8 pads. You want to draw inspiration from this objects project. So this objects project has pretty much all of the patterns that you want to follow in order to populate a list or an array with objects. Now, once you do that, next week what we're going to do is we're going to start to see how we can then render this list of pads to the screen and do kind of some cool stuff with it and get different sounds on the screen. Now, remember, every time you create a new pad, you have the ability to change certain properties about that pad. So for example, you're gonna probably want to change the frequency of a given pad because each pad is gonna have a different sound. So by just passing in a different frequency, you're gonna see that there will be a different sound. And even before you create the list of pads, you may want to just play around with this and change these frequencies to see how the sound changes and kind of what different sounds that you can get from this. All right, guys, have fun. Any questions you have, please post to Canvas, and I'll be available to answer them. Awesome. Thanks, guys.